Brothers and sisters, welcome to our Into the Deep session. It is a joy to be with you as we have begun this beautiful season of Lent and as we continue to celebrate the great year of St. Joseph declared by Pope Francis on December 8, 2020. So I hope and pray that you're all well. You're all journeying well throughout this beautiful season of Lent. Tonight, Into the Deep presents us with a wonderful topic and a wonderful opportunity to look into the laity and the call to conversion. We're all called to conversion, and Lent truly provides us with a special moment to reflect on its true and continuing significance. We sometimes may think that the act of conversion is also about ourselves, as uniquely personal as our own, but truly, in fact, we are all agents of conversion as well. And so conversion is not merely individualistic, it is communal, it has a social dimension, and it calls us to really deeper fidelity with Jesus Christ. And so this talk on the laity and call to conversion is very timely for us throughout the Lenten season. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Michael Higgins. I'm very happy to introduce you to Dr. Higgins. He just moved recently here in Vancouver from Connecticut, where my community is from. So we have that element in common. So Dr. Higgins is a native of Toronto. He's an author and scholar, Vatican Affairs specialist for the Globe and the Mail, papal commentator for CTV Network. He's an educator, CBC radio documentarian, columnist, and the former senior academic administrator. So a variety of experience that Dr. Higgins brings to us tonight. He has served as the president and vice chancellor at St. Jerome University in Waterloo, Ontario, and at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick, and has the vice president for mission and Catholic identity at Sacred Heart University, Fairfield, Connecticut. He was named Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Catholic Thought in the fall of 2020, and he's also the recipient of many awards, including 2 honorary doctorates. Father Higgins has edited, co-authored, and authored many books. He's a regular contributor to Commonwealth, New York, the Literary Review of Canada, the Tablet London, and has been a columnist for many years for many Canadian newspapers and journals. So when he moved here to Vancouver, or the reason why he moved to Vancouver is because Dr. Higgins is now the principal and president of our college, St. Mark's College and Corpus Christi College at the University of British Columbia. So what a great gift to have him with us at our Catholic colleges here in the Archdiocese. He is married to Christina, who is a liturgical musician and a writer as well, and they have 4 adult children. So we're very excited to have Dr. Higgins with us tonight and to learn from him. Pope Francis, in his Lenten message that is entitled, "Behold, we're going up to Jerusalem, Lent, a time for renewing faith, hope, and love," he writes, "In our Lenten journey towards Easter, let us all remember the one who humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. During this season of conversion, let us renew our faith, draw from the living water of hope, and receive with open hearts the love of God who makes us brothers and sisters in Christ." So we look forward to hear Dr. Higgins tonight on the laity and the call to conversion. And Dr. Higgins will begin us with a prayer. So welcome, Dr. Higgins. It's such a joy to have you with us tonight.
The experience of Lent. Yet even now, says the Lord, return to me with all your heart. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Well, the season of Lent calls us in a special way to focus on reflection and on repentance and on renewal. Our forgiving God invites us to lay down whatever burdens of past failures and guilt that we may be carrying. And Lent offers us the opportunity to set out afresh on the path of faithful discipleship. Merciful and loving God, you know our sins and you know our weaknesses. You see the poor choices we sometimes make and the guilt that can hold us back, yet you always offer us forgiveness and a welcoming embrace. During this holy season of Lent, may we take time to examine our relationship with you and with one another. We turn back to you, aware of our sinfulness, but trusting in your unfailing love. Help us to renew our commitment to be your faithful disciples as we journey together towards you. Amen. Now you'll notice in the prayer, there's an emphasis not only on my moving towards God, but on my moving with others towards God. And I think we need to keep this in mind when we're talking about conversion, don't we? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Conversion and the role particularly that the laity have in that. It's not that the laity are uniquely charged with the need to convert. This is true, as Sister already indicated, for all of us. Conversion and the constant dynamic or momentum involved with conversion is the responsibility, the obligation of all baptized, irrespective of their ministry. So conversion is not a uniquely lay thing any more than it's a uniquely religious thing. It's something that comes out of the very nature of our baptism. So what does it mean when we talk about conversion? Well, it's important to recognize that conversion is both a noun and it is a verb. It is an event and it is also a process. It's a turning from and it's a turning toward. Now, I don't know about you, but I've always been enormously interested in stories of conversion. Not because they necessarily could be inspiring, they can be, but also because they're just quite simply interesting. They're great stories. When you think of Christian history, you often think of conversions, and there are many of them, and they're full of drama and heroism sometimes not so much. Sometimes they involve martyrdom, the supreme sacrifice. In other instances, it's just the steady presence and attention in time over a short period, like Thérèse de Lisieux, living relatively removed, living a very common life, but living an intensity of mystical awareness. That is as the result of a constant conversion or turning towards, not turning against, turning back, but turning towards. You know, quite a number of years ago, a marvelous professor of French literature at Oxford, a man by the name of Albin Cruilchamer. Now, Cruilchamer wrote a book called Conversion. He was an expert on the great 17th century French mystic and mathematician Blaise Pascal, and had in fact translated his Pensées and his provincial letters for Penguin. He was also a professor at Oxford, as I said. And he wrote this very interesting book called Conversion. And what he did was he took various types, tried to find a template, paradigms. People convert in different ways. The conversion of Francesco de Bernardone is different than the conversion of Augustine of Hippo. The conversion of Ignatius of Loyola is different from the conversion, for instance, of John Henry Cardinal Nouwen. They experience conversions in different ways. And what we have is we have the noun conversion. In other words, a specific event. St. Paul falls off his horse on his way to Damascus. Great moment. He turns toward the Lord, right? Some arresting moment, some dramatic moment, upsetting, overwhelming an upheaval, an emotional, intellectual, and spiritual upheaval. Conversion can be like that. It can be dramatic. It can be spontaneous. But conversion can also be cumulative. In other words, you take a time for it. I'll give you a wonderful example. Cardinal Nouwen, now Saint John Henry Nouwen, his conversion to Catholicism actually began about 1838. He actually became a Roman Catholic in 1845. And so you say, well, what happened in all those years? He was thinking his way into the Church of Rome. He was already an Anglican cleric. He was already a baptized Christian, but he was thinking his way into the Catholic Church. And I mentioned Nouwen because he's so important for those of us in the university, but for those of us who think very importantly that the work of the mind is essential for a deep adult faith. that, when we're called to conversion, when we're called to live out of faith, we don't put our mind on hold. Our mind doesn't atrophy. It's not put in the refrigerator. Our mind is engaged like our heart in seeking the truth, in seeking God, goodness, and beauty. And so Nouwen's slow, cumulative, methodical, very deep and reflective conversion, very different from Francis of Assisi, very different from some of the other great conversions over time. And that's what's important to understand, that although there were maybe various paradigms or models of conversion, there's no one univocal, one way of doing it. Conversions happen in different ways, depending on our personality, depending on our history, depending on our particular gifts, depending on our circumstances. And so if you look at some of the great conversions, as I said, St. Paul, for instance, or St. Augustine, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Ignatius of Loyola. I love the story of Ignatius of Loyola. Many years ago, I wrote a book called The Jesuit Mystique, which was also a CBC series. And during the work of the research, spending quite a few years actually, traveling fairly extensively for research on the matter, and I'll come back to one particular instance that I think is quite moving when talking about conversion, I was particularly struck by the nature of Ignatius's conversion. One Jesuit who was president of Regis College at the time just simply said, oh, by the way, the lights come in and off here. It's not that I'm losing interest or falling asleep or suddenly we have an eclipse. It's just the crazy lighting arrangement in my office. As long as you can see me, that's the important thing. The conversion of Ignatius of Loyola is an especially electric, dramatic one. And as I said, the president of Regis College said, well, with Ignatius, it was a cannonball. It was a cannonball that was the instrument or the occasion for the conversion of the founder of the Society of Jesus, the largest and in some instances the most influential order in the Roman Catholic Church. Not insignificantly, our current Pope Francis is a Jesuit. Well, what happened is, as a young man, he was a soldier, and a soldier of fortune, but also somebody who was engaged in the defense of Pamplona. And during the defense, the French troops fired a cannon, and he was hit in the leg, and the city fell. And he was forced into convalescence, a very long period of convalescence. So this is a fairly handsome guy, accustomed to being kind of a chevalier, a caballero. He enjoys being a knight. He enjoys all the things that go with being a knight. He likes good clothes. He likes to mingle among women. He likes to indulge all his passions, his enthusiasms as a heroic Spanish junior, largely insignificant, but nonetheless junior aristocrat. Well, things change with a cannonball. The cannonball lays him up, and so he spends a great deal of time lying in bed. The doctors have a very difficult time setting the leg. In fact, they set it badly. They have to break the leg again. So he undergoes a fair bit of physical torture. What is particularly difficult for him is he doesn't have anything to read. And even at that age, although interested in gallantry and interested in war and interested in the things that men of his class would have been interested in at the time, he's also interested in reading. But there are very few books around. One is the scriptures, and one is a collection of the lives of the saints. And so he works his way through these books. And as he does, God's grace works its way in his heart. And so what happens that when he's no longer convalescent, when he's able now to get out of bed, when he's able again to have a life, it is not the life that he had before. So the conversion in his case is a highly dramatic one, precipitated by a wound that he would never have anticipated nor desired. But what it did is provided him with the occasion to think deeply, very deeply about his life, about the role of Jesus in his life, both the role of grace, the role of prayer, the role of discernment. And of course, out of these things over the years, in other contexts and other places, would eventually come all kinds of things, his letters, the constitutions, but most importantly, the exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. This is just the beginning. The conversion is just the beginning, but the conversion goes on and takes him to Rome, it takes him to Jerusalem, and it takes him, well, initially to Paris. It takes him to places perhaps he would never have thought of going. So the conversion isn't just moving away from the life that he had in the past. It's moving toward God in a new way. This is a new drama unfolding for him. It is a new journey. Now, Ignatius's life, full of color and heroism and circumstance, as I've described it, you may say, well, that's not my life. I mean, I live in Surrey. I go out, I work as a lawyer, I work in dry goods, I do all kinds of different things, but these kinds of moments don't happen to me. I don't have these sudden moments of illumination. I don't have these great dramatic conversions. And of course, you would be right, because the majority of us don't have that. But the drama of conversion doesn't always play itself out in the theater of our lives. Sometimes it's quiet, as I said earlier, cumulative, a slow turning, but a turning toward God, endless, methodical. And so again, this is so dependent on our own unique circumstances, who we are, where we are, the gifts we possess, the cultural circumstances in which we grow, the place where we find ourselves. And if you look at some of the other conversions, some of the more contemporary, for instance, two remarkable women, Edith Stein and Dorothy Day, are marvelous examples. These extraordinary women. Dorothy Day is most likely to be canonized shortly. She's been beatified. You will recognize her as this quite remarkable woman who died in 1980, who nonetheless, throughout her life, had various kinds of moments of conversion. She was at one point a Marxist. She was a woman who engaged quite openly in free love. She had lovers like Eugene O'Neill, for instance. She had an abortion. She had a child she wanted to keep. She engaged in political confrontation. And then she experienced in a very profound way the power of the gospel and the power of Jesus. And she turned her life around. She turned her life in an entirely new direction. And so for several decades, she built up a ministry second to none in the history of US Catholicism. One of the great figures, one of the great colorful characters in the panoply of American Catholicism. And not just American Catholicism. When Pope Francis came to the United States to speak to Congress, you may remember that he identified 4 specific moral and prophetic figures who had enormous influence on American life and who were models for him. And they were Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, but Dorothy Day and the great Trappist monk, Thomas Merton. So Francis identified Dorothy Day already as a figure of marginal and peripheral, a figure who identified with the poor, but a figure who changed the history in so many ways of how American Catholics, and again, outside the American Catholic Church, because she's read all over the world in English and in other languages, how her identification with the poor, utter, complete, total, no compromise, all right? She was a pacifist and believed profoundly in the kind of, quotation marks, nascent, or not nascent, but native or primitive communism that you find in the Acts of the Apostles. She was no Marxist. She had been, but she was no longer a Marxist. But what was important was she was against violence. So she was a pacifist. She was deeply believed in the liberating power of poverty. But she most importantly understood that one needed to be a witness to and to attend and to accompany the marginalized. This became a decades-long conversion. This is my point. Even if you have a dramatic moment of conversion, it doesn't end there. I'm converted, okay, everything's fine now. That doesn't happen. It's one of the great challenges that people face when they go through the catechumenate and when they are received into the church on Easter. They're full of enthusiasm, are they not? I mean, perhaps even ecstatic. They're alive to the Spirit and they're ready to go forward. And then all of a sudden, tepidity sets in. They get rather tepid, they get warm, they get mediocre, they begin to lose interest. Why? Now, not all of them by any means, but why? Because that's human living. It takes a lot of difficulty and a lot of challenge for us sometimes to refuel ourselves, to recharge ourselves spiritually. That's why we have Lent, which one of the reasons when we say, okay, we go a little deeper here, I mean, that's after all the name of this program, we go a little deeper in order to understand a little better where we are now. It's not like it's come to an end. A conversion doesn't end anything. A conversion is always the beginning of something else, because we're always engaged in the act of conversion. It's a process. And there's a wonderful example, the French term enroullement. Teilhard de Chardin often talked about it in terms of evolution, that it's not a trajectory like this, okay? It's a gyre. It goes up this way and then back down, goes back up again, and a little further up, then back down, a spiral. That's how it works. It's a gyre or a spiral. And that's a better symbol, I think, or image of conversion, than the idea is just shooting right up there and everything's fine and nothing ever goes wrong. Well, that's just not human life. I mean, St. Paul had his doubts. St. Augustine wrestled with things after his conversion, during his post-conversion. Everyone goes through periods of doubt and ennui or boredom or torpor or acidity, whatever the language we use. The noonday devil is what they often talk about, the desert fathers and the monks. When we're faced with this lassitude, we've lost interest. We don't have the energy. The Spirit's not with us. Somehow or other, we're just being emptied or evacuated of the wonderful things that charged us when we first had our conversion, or we had our epiphany, or we had our moment of revelation, or when we deepened our relationship with Jesus. And that somehow or other, we don't have that anymore. Well, we do. We have to recover it. That's why we have Lent, and that's why we have other things in the liturgical cycle, because that's what we're like as human beings. So conversion isn't just an event. It's not just a noun. It is a verb, to convert, convertare, to convert. We convert again and again. We go back and we renew. It is not a single event. It is a lifelong process. It's a dynamic that unfolds, that has its twists and its turns, its ups and its downs, its moments of light and its moments of darkness. It's like anything, really. I mean, if you're ordained to ministry, you take sacred vows as a consecrated religious. You witness publicly to your partner, and you become spouses in the sacrament of marriage. There are ups and downs, moments when you need to recharge, moments when you need to re-engage, moments when you need to say, okay, well, I'm in a dark space now, or I seem to have drifted into some strange lassitude where I don't seem to have the energy I used to have. That's absolutely and utterly human, and it's not to be feared. It's not to be denied. It's not even to be loathed. It's to be seen as an important component, part of the chemistry of who we are spiritually and emotionally. So you go with what you have and say, okay, I'm in a dark space, I go deeper. One has to always remember, and it's very touching. Many years ago, I wrote a book called Stalking the Holy, in pursuit of saint-making. The CBC series was called Stalking the Holy, the Politics of Saint-Making, but the book came out with a different title. And I was sent to cover the canonization of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And I got to tell you, I've covered some of these things before. They're really, well, for me anyway, boring. They bring out the water cannons to shoot at people, not to disperse the crowd, but to rehydrate them. Because if you're gathered in the Piazza San Pietro in the middle of the Ferragosto in Rome, you're dehydrated, just standing there waiting for this event to unfold, and it unfolds over several hours. And so people constantly need to be refreshed. And so they bring out the water cannons, or at least they did when I was there, and they spray them to keep them alive. So rehydrate them, because the people are there in an important way because they had deep love for or affection for Mother Teresa. And many people would say to me, well, you know, Mother Teresa, I mean, she was full of dogmatic certitude. She never had any doubt. I mean, what kind of a person was she? She was autocratic. And there's a lot of criticism of Mother Teresa over the years, and not just in the secular media. But that's a massive misreading of her, because we know from the promoter of the cause, the person who was advocating her candidacy through the process of canonization and the earlier processes, have access to her diaries. And we know that from the late 1940s on, almost to the time of her death, what she experienced often was not God's presence, but God's absence. And I think that this is sometimes quite surprising to people, that conversion, spiritual growth, deepening, entering more deeply into the heart of Jesus doesn't mean necessarily that you're constantly upbeat, that you can taste God's presence on a daily basis, that God's right beside your elbow. God may well not be there at all. I mean, we call this the apophatic way. It's the way of negation. God just simply is not there. But that intense love of God is in no way diminished. In fact, it's a remarkable miracle in its own right. The intensity of her commitment to the poor, to the broken, to the dying, was her conduit to God. It was her way to the God whose tangibility she no longer felt. So again, conversion, deep spiritual experience, turning toward God, it's a complicated issue. It's multivalent. It has many levels and it has many conduits. It's not just simply a matter of saying, well, this is it, and I'm a convert now and everything is settled. When you say that, you know it's not settled, or rather you've not grasped what conversion really means. Conversion, in one sense, is a very deep spiritual unsettling. It's not a matter of stabilizing you, of giving you certitude of saying, okay, you're converted now, you don't have to worry about anything anymore, everything's fine, God loves you, and that's it. That's not what conversion is about. It's one of the things that always distresses me with the American televangelists and their prosperity gospel and their television programs, in which they're always talking about conversion as if it were some kind of easily created phenomenon, as if it were a private commodity, which you have. I possess it. I'm converted. I know God now. Nothing else matters. I can completely rest in God's bosom. It doesn't matter anything else. Well, that's, I'm afraid, a caricature of the gospel, and it is a rather blasphemous portrait of God. God is much more complicated than that, and every attempt to approximate God and to contain God, to hold God, is a form of heresy. That's one of the strengths of the Catholic tradition, is we don't make the argument that we possess God, or indeed that we possess wisdom, but that God or wisdom possesses us. And so the important thing to understand, again, is that the act of conversion is precisely that. It is an ongoing act. It is an ongoing dynamic. It's an ongoing movement moving toward God, toward a deepening understanding of God. And you don't do this in isolation. You don't do this in a silo. You don't do this in an ivory tower. Those of us who live in the academy sometimes like to think that maybe that's the best way to do it. We write theological tomes, we give lectures, we do all kinds of things, and this is our way to God. And that way we don't get contaminated by dealing with other things. That's an illusion. God is not to be contained anymore in our books, then God is to be contained in our chapels and our temples or whatever. God is ubiquitous. God's presence cannot be contained. But what is important is to be able to touch God's presence through the sacraments and through so many other ways, in which art and through music and through other things that do what? Just simply give us aesthetic pleasure? No, but open our heart, open our imagination, open our mind to the God who loves us. Lent is the liturgical time of conversion. And we also have Advent, and Advent has its own penitential dimension, as you know. It's a time of expectation, but it's a time also of penance. But Lent is specifically penitential as it builds toward that marvelous climax of Holy Week and of the Risen One. But our spiritual lives, again, don't operate only at the level of high enthusiasm and ecstasy. We have boredom, or what the French call ennui, which is a special kind of devastating or eviscerating boredom, torpor, acidity, lassitude, when we just don't care anymore. And we sometimes go through these stages, right? And some of it may be clinical depression, actually. Some of it may be spiritual depression. More often than not, it's a combination of the emotional, the psyche, the spiritual. We're complex human beings. And so all these components work together, right? And so sometimes we just simply lose the luster for life. We lose that spark. We get tired. We experience a certain kind of spiritual and emotional exhaustion. And then we want to keep God and the demands of a deepening humanity at bay. In a time of plague, which is our time when we exist under the pall of the pandemic, It's so easy to want to withdraw, is it not? We grow tired, we experience fatigue, there is tremendous mental pressure on us. Mental illness and instances of mental illness have increased exponentially. People find themselves in increased isolation, sometimes self-isolation now, because they're moving into a depressive spiral. And so these issues, again, precisely because they call us to withdraw into ourselves, is contra conversion, which draws us out of ourselves, right? So conversion is not about me and Jesus. Conversion is not about, okay, I've got it now and I don't need to worry about everybody else. This is my commodity. I purchased this. I mean, God loves me. Whether God loves anybody else, well, that's God's choice. But God loves me and I'm God's. Well, there's such spiritual arrogance in such a declaration that it's humbling even to have to say it. Where do we stand? We stand in relation to God by adoration, by recognizing our weakness, but also recognizing our divinity. I mean, the Eastern Church Fathers often had a very deep sense about the divinization of humanity, which in the West we don't very much talk about, but it's a recognition of the spark of divinity in us, that the human isn't just a concatenation of cells, but that we are loved into existence by God. So it's not just simply God loves us into existence and then abandons us, but what it does mean is that in this cycle or in this dynamic, there is a calling and there is a coming forth. And it is in the nature of human unfolding, just as we learn truth through collision of intellect, through dialogue, through struggle, and not just simply by declaring something, we have to actually appropriate and deepen and understand and probe. So too is it with our emotional and spiritual lives. We can't just simply say, well, I've got it now. We don't need to talk about it anymore. I'm converted and that's it. No, conversion is much deeper than that, and it is ongoing. So we have to ask ourselves in a time of Lent, in a time of any kind of reflection or discernment, whether we set it aside for special moments of the day or whatever, how do we reawaken this? How do we refuel? How do we recharge? How do we make ourselves again attentive to the divine within us? How do we move toward God? Yes, with tentativeness. Yes, with humility. Yes, with a posture of adoration, but knowing full well that this is a demanding and heroic feat in its own way, but it's the only way we're going to grow and deepen. Now, we always do various things, right? Because we're humans. And I don't know about you, but every year at New Year's, long before Lent begins, I make various pledges and promises and proclamations, what I'm going to do. And I do that on December 31st. And by January the 2nd, I'm right back to where I was before. Lent, I have a little more success at. I give up red meat and I give up wine, which I don't drink much anyway. I give up smoking, but then I've never smoked in my life. So actually the sacrifices are so minimal as to be, well, frankly, insulting. But the important thing in all of that is you see it as a kind of a discipline. I'm making an intentional effort to do something different, but I'm very conscious of the fact that it's not only minimal, it's actually quite trivial. It doesn't mean an awful lot. What does matter in conversion, what does matter in Lent, what does matter in giving up is giving up a bit of the ego, giving up a bit of my strength of opinion, maybe humbling myself, maybe paying more attention to those I encounter on the streets who ordinarily their eyes avert because I feel uncomfortable. Following the eyes, going to them and speaking to the homeless is an act of conversion. It's an act of attention to the suffering. It's in fact, and I know that this is a phrase that sometimes we use too glibly, but it is in fact what Jesus would do. But is this act of conversion, this going out of ourselves, of this prolonged period of re-engagement as we struggle to be re-engaged, a private undertaking? Is it our conversion simply? Is it individualistic? Is it my undertaking? Is it a kind of chicken soup for the soul experiment? I remember many years ago, and I was working on a different book called Power and Peril, and there was a particular chapter on spirituality. I wanted to look at what this is around the time, the beginning of the millennium, 2000, 2001. And I wanted to look at, where do people go, particularly in the Roman Catholic communion, where do we go for spiritual nurturing now? It may not be the same saints we've had in the past, maybe not be the same prayers. Some things are constant, some things are not. Some things have their moments, some things recede, depends, right? But I wanted to know where they were. And so I looked at the ecclesial movements, the Focolare, the Neocatechumenate, Comunione e Liberazione, the Opus Dei, all these different movements, and some of them rather large and fairly universal. Some of them are localized and whatnot. What was going on with these things? But one of the things I did discover, and I think it's important, you can identify particular spiritualities, the spirituality of restoration, the spirituality of the wounded, for instance, the spirituality of the marginalized. But you can also see in this a Catholic impulse that runs counter to that kind of American pioneering, commodity-driven spirituality, which I think is anathema to the soul. And I remember actually having quite an argument on one occasion by one of the authors of A Chicken Soup for the Soul, who came up from Texas, who was a graduate of the University of Waterloo, and I was president of a University of Waterloo, to argue about this, because he wanted me to be a co-author of one of the books and to push this, and I wouldn't have anything to do with it. And I said, the problem is, this is very glib. I mean, you don't possess spirituality. Spirituality possesses you. I mean, you can't buy this. I mean, people in a consumer culture think that you produce a booklet or a handbook or an enchiridion, as we used to call it. And this manual, if you buy the manual, you go on the webinar, or you purchase the AV, the DVDs or whatever, and you take a course or you take a seminar, and at the end of it, guess what? You're holy. We have them for all kinds of things, right? Booklets to help us be better parents, booklets to help us invest, booklets to help us raise our children, indeed, to have children, to go through the whole process of birthing, different stages, how you can do this and everything else. Some of this is so natural, one mind boggles of the fact you have to have a manual for it. But there are these, how do you put the car together? How do you do this? How do you put your spiritual life together? So you have people going around giving seminars on the spiritual life. Take this 5-part, take this series on TV, you'll end up being reflective and deeply spiritual. This is crazy. This is not what the spiritual life is about. It's not purchasing a product. It's not a commodity. It's not something you take off a shelf and say, okay, now I'm spiritual. It's a life project. You ache into holiness, okay? You grow into holiness. You go through the struggles, the turmoil, the openings, the shutterings, the shatterings, the glimmerings of grace, the rapture. All of these things happen to you as you move through life, struggling always to be attentive to the movements of the Spirit, to use Ignatian language, but we're not bound only by that. But spirituality is not something you possess any more than a conversion is something that you possess. You hold on to, you put it on a shelf, and you say, "But that's mine." No, it's not. We are, in fact, called to be agents of conversion. And as lay people, we need to think about what that means. What does it mean to be an agent of conversion? Well, in all these things, perhaps it's best to provide some examples. How have people been agents of conversion for me? Because they'll be very different for you, of course. Well, one of them is a young man, a young Jesuit I met in El Salvador. And he took me to a place outside of El Salvador, outside of San Salvador. El Salvador is the country, San Salvador is the city, outside of San Salvador. And it was just shortly after the terrifying civil war that resulted in something like 90,000 deaths, including the slaughter of many religious, not insignificantly, several Jesuits at the Universidad Centroamericana in the city. And of course, even with the Archbishop Oscar Romero, now Saint Oscar Romero. Well, I remember being with him and staying in a small town called Santa Tecla. And during the night, you could hear the guns, the machine guns. Right? And I remember, even though technically the Civil War was over, it wasn't really over because the violence was still there. And I stayed with a nun from the United States. And sometimes in the morning, when we'd get up to go out to work, there would be the head of somebody who decapitated by the guerrillas, or more likely by the Atacatau division of the government, in order to send a deep message. And you live with that horror, you live with that daily grotesquerie. And how do you do that if you're not a person of deep faith, if you're not constantly being converted, moving closer, deeper into God? And I remember Dean Brackley, his name was. He was a young ethicist from Fordham University in New York City, but he went off after the murder of the Jesuits to spend his time replacing a Canadian Jesuit went down as well, and he's now a cardinal, a man by the name of Michael Higgins, a social ethicist who went down to replace one of the Jesuits who was killed, and now works for the Pope as the prefect of the dicastery that deals with migration and refugees. So you end up with a situation where you're standing with somebody and you're saying, well, how do you do this? How do you live through this? And he said quite simply to me something which I've never forgotten, and was kind of, if you like it, a conversion moment for me. He said, you know, really, when you deal with the suffering, when you deal with the oppressed, when you deal with the homeless and the broken, you have to have your heart broken by the poor. Like, you won't get anywhere unless your heart is broken by the poor. Now, that struck me at the time, and I realized afterwards that it was true, and I discovered it fairly soon after this encounter, because I ended up in Jamaica, in the slums of West Kingston, which are next to the slums in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, are the worst slums in the Caribbean. And I was with a Canadian Jesuit in this case, a man by the name of Jim Webb. Both, by the way, Dean Brackley and Jim Webb are now deceased. Died young, actually, both of them. And with Jim Webb, I remember walking through the slums, and he said, stay close to me. And I did. And I noticed in the tremendous heat of the slums, there would come some kids, and they'd run up to him, and they would walk with him, and they would be with him, and he would touch their head, and he would hold them, and they knew that they were loved, and they lived in an environment of intense violence. Right? So in one case, we were walking around a corner, and he made a point of going over to get an ice cream cone, and he got the ice cream cone for one of them, but only one of them. And afterwards, I said to him, I noticed, Jim, that you identified this one person for the ice cream cone, but you didn't give the other. Would this generate resentment from the others, that this is Father Webb's favorite and the others, well, it doesn't really matter? He said, quite the contrary. He said he's mentally challenged. And so among the poor, he's the poorest of the poor. And by identifying him and giving this ice cream cone, I was saying that he was special to me, and that way protecting him. So those kind of moments are quite arresting, because in a way you look at your own life as a consequence, and what are the demands of your own faith in a context like this, right? You take these small, but even mini dramatic conversion moments, and then you have to find a way of putting together the larger mosaic. Like, what is this telling me? Is there an epiphany here? Is there some kind of manifestation, some kind of revelation? Not with the angels, with the cherubim, or the seraphim, the thrones and dominations all coming down for a great big party, but rather with just an enlightened moment, an illumination, a moment of grace, a moment of realization. And sometimes that's where joy radiates, because even though we're in the middle, we're not in the middle, we're still in the early stages of Lent, there's joy in all of this. It's not just simply sackcloth and ashes. There is joy in the knowledge of what comes from it. Joy in the knowledge that in a very real way, Jesus is joy. It's the joy that radiates. I want to read you something here that from somebody I knew really quite well, an old friend who I worked with for many years. And he's a recently retired judge, and he's a law poet here in Canada. His name is James Clark. Not since F.R. Scott have we had a law poet of his stature. And he lived his life as a judge and lived it with great distinction. But one of the things he also did was to take his children and move them to France to live in Trolley-Breuil, which of course is the original home of Jean Vanier and the L'Arche movement, in the L'Arche movement. And this was so formative for him and for the rest of the family. I want to just read a couple of things here because I want to talk to you about a particular moment of conversion for him, which in conversation served as a moment of me rethinking some things myself, and therefore he was acting as an agent of conversion for me. Here's what. James Clark, lawyer, father, and writer, chose with his artist wife, Mary, to bring his family with him to the very seat of L'Arche, Torrebreuil, for a 9-month period. It was not a sabbatical, it was an epiphany. He just gave up his law practice in Toronto and off they went. Out of his time at Tralee, Clark would write his first work called L'Arche Journal, a family's experience in Jean Vanier's community. It's a human record charged with love. Now, Clark does not disguise the frustrations, the failures and foibles of community living. He has no time for cheap grace. At one point, after marveling at Beauvais Cathedral with its spaces of dazzling light, he pointedly observes, "It's strange how dark, lifeless, and even forbidding the stained glass windows of the great cathedrals appear from the outside, but from the inside. What a contrast. Is this the experience of most people with the mentally challenged? Dark on the outside, luminous from within." Clark quickly discovered that life with the mentally challenged was indeed different viewed from the inside. It was incandescent rather than dark. It was a channel of hope rather than a cavern of despair. Many years after their experience at Tralee, the Clark family would be deeply pained by Mary's suicide, his wife and the mother, a death by drowning that prompted the now judge poet and unforgiving lover to write Proper Burial. This is the poem he wrote on the occasion of her dying by her own hand. And I remember the funeral mass being there with the children. "Oh, how we tried to give you a proper burial that Sunday afternoon in Easter week, while your portrait gazed at us from the sanctuary, sprinkling you with holy water, robing you with incense, singing till we could no longer hear your unquiet spirit. And still at Eastertide I sometimes hear lilies weeping in the sun, your voice like Niagara roaring in the night." The Niagara is a striking image because that's how she died. Deeply depressed, suffering from mental illness, she slipped into the Niagara River, went over the Niagara Falls, and her body was never discovered. Now, how do you move out of that grief if you're a person of faith? How do you bring the children with you? How do you encompass them with love? The struggle for ever deepening conversion through grief, through absence, through loss became a momentous and startling road to spiritual wisdom in the life of this judge. He's still very much alive, in his late 80s now. I saw him recently, still writing poetry, a man suffused with faith. The death of his wife was devastating, but it also became a particular moment of conversion for him, a deeper understanding of the love that he had for his wife, and a deeper understanding of the God who loved her and loves him. In that process, he became an agent of conversion for me. I could begin to see the untapped depths of that kind of love, that kenotic love, that self-emptying love that we talk about with the Deutero-Isaiah, and that we see most perfectly realized in the broken Christ on the cross. So this is real stuff. This isn't a theological theorem. This isn't a lesson in catechetics. It's not a special moment of possessing the truth. It is the raw blood, the meat and the marrow, the stuff that makes up our lives, the viscera, physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual, that makes us who we are. But we are called into existence, loved into existence by God. So how do we work this? How do we find ways, looking at our lives and looking towards that constant call, turning toward God, which is what conversion is? How do we continue that act of conversion if we see it only as a private enterprise. I'm on my trip to God. I'm converted. It's all done. The pact has been sealed. I've signed on. Everything is fine. I can do what I like. And in its most nefarious form, I enjoy great prosperity because I'm beloved by God. In sharp contrast with that poor fellow over there who's lying in the street and obviously does not enjoy God's favor. This is heresy. This is not what the gospel or the Christ of Catholic Christianity teaches. The broken Christ is the means by which we enter into the deeper love of divinity. And so it's important to realize that turning toward God makes its own demands. But those demands aren't necessarily catastrophic and sudden, right? It's not a matter, most of us will not be faced with an experience, what we call odium fidei, hatred of the faith. Somebody calls us up and said, you have to denounce Jesus right now, you have to denounce the church or blow your brains out, and you have to make the decision whether you're going to be a martyr or not. That's not the way it happens. In the vast majority of cases, we wrestle with our kind of daily martyrdoms, how we deal with suffering, how do we deal with the crises in our lives, how do we deal with the broken people who operate within our orbit, the people that we're called to care for. So those conversion moments are conversions, again, away from and toward. It's a positive dynamic, but it's like a gyre. It's like a spiral, en roulement. It's going up and then a little down, but going up. But still the progress is forward. Okay, you're still going up. All right? It's not the trajectory. Because trajectories sometimes they shoot up and then they shoot down like a Roman candle. And that's it. And I've seen that happen, as I'm sure maybe some of you have. People just, I don't know, full of enthusiasm and the fire of initial conversion, and then it peters out. And no effort is made to sustain it, as if somehow, well, it's disappointed me. I thought it was really exciting at one point. Now, what am I going to deal with? But the point is with conversion, it's the top part that comes between, okay? What the saints and the mystics and the spiritual writers all recognize as that large gap in our life, large between in our lives, between a moment of turning toward God and being embraced by God, right? It's a long time sometimes. And it's a matter of moving forward and moving back. The summons to the now, then. How do we affect conversion, not only in others, but in institutions? You know, we have to keep in mind not only the letter of St. James and the writings of the popes, particularly recent pontiffs, talking specifically about the need for social justice witness. We have to recognize that that is a communal moment. That conversion isn't, again, just a solo act, not just a private act. We need now to find ways of moving forward. We need to find ways of institutional repentance. We need ways of overriding scandal. And we have enough scandals in the institutional church. We all know that. We're not blind to it. We know that we need to address our own failings. And so as both communally and individually, both personally and operating within the larger context of shared faith, we move toward conversion. And conversion involves not only conversion or change of attitude, not only a change of mind, a change of disposition, a change of insight and understanding. It also involves a change in institutional structures. How do we affect those changes? How do we help our own structures, our own broken church? How do we help it ourselves accommodate or conform more to the genuine mind of Christ? How conversion, therefore, is a process that's multi-layered, as I said earlier, and it's demanding, and it can be very deeply unsettling. It's not a point of purchase. It's not something that one discovers easily. It's not something that you hide in the closet, your possession not to be shared with others. It calls you forward, because that's what conversion does. It calls us forward out of the things that are our handicaps, our spiritual and emotional handicaps that keep us in bondage to illusion, to failure, to exalted sense of our own worth, to the fact that we possess our own wisdom, to a deeper truth that we are possessed by wisdom, that we are called to a form of agency. We are called to be companions along the way. We're called to discernment. We're called to recognize, as Pope Francis again and again reminds us, of our common home. And our common home isn't just our ecological space, though it is that. It's not just our planet, for which we have the obligations of stewardship. It's also the community in which we live, the small community, the local community that is our family, the larger community, which is our extended family, and the human family itself. That's one great big leap. We don't make it easily, and often we can't make it. It's like when you get up in the morning and you turn on the CBC or whatever, and you hear yet again the array of statistics. We bludgeon ourselves with statistics. And what often happens is the statistics wear us down. They desensitize us. The numbers mean nothing. It's the human that means something. It's the concentration on the singular that really evokes change. When we recognize and acknowledge the other, not as a group, not as an entity, not as something outside, but as called to companionship, when we begin to see that way, then we're slowly moving to a deepening in our spiritual life, responding to the power of grace, and recognizing that conversion indeed is a lifelong effort, an aching into holiness, never complete, communal and personal, private and public. Okay, now I think, I've gone on for a bit of time, quite long-winded I am, quite prolix. Anyway, I'm quite open for questions or commentary now, and happy to entertain any that may arise.
Thank you so much, Dr. Higgins. What a blessing to really have you closely to the beginning of this Lenten season to speak to us about conversion and to really open our eyes to the many opportunities that this time offers us. And as I listen to you, I think, if I really allowed my heart to be broken by the poor, what were those moments in my own life? And I think of with great gratitude of the people who I look back and see being agents for my own conversion and for moments of conversion throughout my life, and to think of ways that I might have been able to be an agent of conversion to others, and truly the desire that it is my heart to be such an agent of conversion, to be an instrument in God's hands so that others could come to him. And I think what have been those moments of graces, have I been attentive to it, I have recognized it, I have spent time to really step back and say thank you to our Lord and to all the people who have allowed me bit by bit to turn towards him closer and closer. And so I think I look forward with great excitement of many more of those moments. As you say, conversion is a lifelong journey. And I look forward to do it that with my community, with my friends, my family, with the extended community, with the church. So thank you so much for your very inspirational talk tonight. And I see a couple of questions coming in, so I'm going to ask them. And the first one is, how do you live with a husband that has no faith? How do I help him to come to conversion? So
that's a tough but a beautiful question in its own way, and not unique. You'd be surprised at how many find themselves in a situation like that. Their partner or their companion or their spouse, somebody they deeply love, doesn't share their religious conviction. But faith can't be legislated. It's a gift. It's the gratuitousness that often surprises us, right? And so we think, okay, well, since we know this to be the case, and since we've experienced the power of conversion in our own lives, why can we not communicate that to somebody whom we deeply love, who seems to be resistant to it? Well, they may not be resistant, in fact. It may just simply be that their own route to God is different than yours. What matters is the integrity of your witness. That's charisma. The most effective missioners or evangelizers are people who simply live their lives with integrity. In other words, there's a congruence of what you say with how you live. And it's so difficult when we face the hypocrisies in political life, in church life, in academic life, when people espouse one way and they live a different way. It becomes a source of scandal, and we all know that. And so you can have scandal even in your own life when the person you're trying to witness to and to persuade is also struck by the discrepancies or the contradictions of your own life, which you're not even aware of. So what often can happen, and you can see this in certain particular instances, and sometimes very late in life, is that somebody will be deeply touched by that witness and by love in a way you don't even recognize. There are some really quite extraordinary conversions. I mean, surprising number of deathbed conversions. People like Bob Hope, John Wayne, Oscar Wilde, I mean, Gary Cooper. I mean, we could go through a whole list. Tennessee Williams and Ernest Hemingway were converts, but they were converts of a particular kind that were in and out. I mean, conversions admit of a huge variety of the human reality, right? And as a consequence, they can be very colorful. And what I've been trying to establish tonight is that they're not static, that they're dynamic, and that your love for your husband is not a static love. It's a dynamic love. It's a solicitous love. It's a caring love. You want him to share precisely in the joy and conviction that comes from your own faith. Well, that faith will be most manifest in the joy in which you live that faith, not in your efforts to convert him. You'll convert him by your life. You'll convert him by your words. So it's always really important to recognize that legislating truth or forcing people to be religious never works. It never works. Partly because we despair of God's own grace. God, it's gratuitous. I mean, this is not something we say, well, we're going to purchase some faith today. And if you read this booklet, at the end of the booklet, you will have faith. It's not like becoming a Maoist or a Marxist. You buy a little manual and then you pick up the ideological mantras. The next thing you know, you're a convert to the system. Christianity is much more complicated than that because, as Pope Benedict XVI said when he was Joseph Ratzinger, Jesus is an encounter. Jesus is an encounter. He's an event. And so it's a dynamic, right? It's a dynamic. So in your witness to your faith, how you live that faith, that's the most profound way in which you can express not only your love for your husband, but your hope that he will share in your faith. And perhaps, who knows, he may well. You know?
Thank you so much, Dr. Higgins. What a beautiful answer. And the next question moves from family to institution. How do we affect conversion of institutions?
Yes, that's a good question. One of the things that, I mean, we don't like to talk about these things, but we need to do so, and our own Archbishop has done so quite publicly, great to his credit, is that in the church we face the toxin or the poison of sex abuse. And popes have wrestled with this with varying degrees of success. And what needs to happen is, again, institutional conversion. Like, we've got to find ways to move beyond this. I've written a book about this. It won an award I co-authored with a lawyer friend of mine, now deceased, Peter Kavanaugh, called Suffer the Children Unto Me. And one of the things I learned in the experience of going into a very dark place, I mean, never compromised my faith, I have to say. People have asked me sometimes on television and radio, did you lose your faith writing this book? And I said, no, of course not. My faith is in the carpenter's son. I recognize fully the pathologies that affect every institution. Am I scandalized by our failure to live by the gospel? Of course I am, but it doesn't mean that I abandon my faith. My faith is deeper than that. But then you have to ask yourself, okay, how do we move forward here? How do we begin to change institutionally so some of these issues don't perdure? I mean, it's one of the biggest crises since the Reformation for the Catholic Church, by the way. It's had a huge impact on the effectiveness of our witness. Large numbers of Catholics have hemorrhaged as a consequence. So we've got a problem here. How are we going to address this? Well, there's a wonderful woman, a nun, daughter of a sister of charity from Halifax. Some of you may have known her. I think she's been in Vancouver many times. Archbishop Miller is very fond of her. A sister by the name of Nouwen Kenny. She's a pediatrician. She is an ethicist. And this has become one of her great passions. I mean, she's got a new book out now on prophetic possibilities for the church. And what she's writing is about change, conversion of the institution, because she hasn't abandoned it. You don't abandon what you love. You work to reform it from within. That's the history of the reformers. It's the history of the saints. mean, look at St. Francis dealing with the corruption during the time of Innocent. Look at St. Ignatius of Loyola. He comes out of the fiery furnace of the collapse of Europe during the Reformation, right? The Francis de Sales, all the great saints coming out of the 30 Years' War, all the problems, the Revolution of France, and then the emergence of all these congregations in the 19th century, many of which had a huge impact on Canada and the United States. Many of the religious congregations that came over are congregations that were created post-Revolution France, even post-Revolution 1848. So there's an historical context for these things, right? And they are always responsible to do what? To reform the church. Ecclesia semper reformanda, the church ever reforming. It's not perfect. And one of the ways to effect institutional conversion is to say it's not perfect, not to protect the reputation, but to look at the pathology. As Pope Benedict XVI himself said at one point, just around the time of the crisis in Ireland, he said, we got to address the rot. You know, you just can't sit around and say, well, this was unfortunate. How did this happen? You have to say, how do we change this? This is how Catherine of Siena dealt with the fact she was dealing with 3 popes at the same time. Okay, and they call a council. She's reprimanding them, saying, well, what are you doing? We got 3 popes. This doesn't make any sense. And you begin to realize that lay people and nuns, as Sister well knows, are canonically lay people like ourselves, right? So we're all lay. We're called to be agents of conversion. And if you look at the Catholic Church's history, you will find them. Remarkable lay people who became agents of institutional conversion because what they saw was no longer proximate to the witness of the gospel. Okay, so that's how we do it. And we need to be true to ourselves. We need to be doing it not out of anger, but out of love. And that's tough, right? I mean, so very often in these cases, people are angry, they're broken, and they're furious, and often that's because they feel betrayed. You often get furious with someone or an institution that you've loved that you feel has betrayed you. That's why your emotions are so intense, right? But you marshal those emotions and say, okay, this is not good what I've experienced, right? This is not what I understand Jesus and the church to be about. How do I change this? How do I change it from within? How do I begin the process of conversion? And some of it can just be simply, as Simon Weil, the great mystic, said, it's just simply attending, being in attention. What she translated from the French, waiting on God. We wait on God.
Thank you again, Dr. Higgins. The following question speaks about how, or asks about how to evangelize and give spiritual advices to our brothers and sisters who are mentally challenged.
That's a very good question. Mm-hmm. Very often, I mean, we all know, or perhaps most of us know, the scandals that were attendant in recent years on the life of Jean Vanier. We shouldn't allow that to diminish in any way the power of his ministry. We have to differentiate between the flaws of the man and the brilliant ministry of his work. Right? And when I was in Tralee and when I was at a large home in Toronto, what always struck me is that I didn't need to spend any time evangelizing them because they evangelized me. And it was distinguished by their joy. They don't set limits or compromises to their experience of joy. They are naturally who they are. They grab you, they hold you, they let out a scream of joy. They come and they sit with you. They don't follow particular protocols. They just want to be tangible. They want to touch and they want to be touched. And as a consequence, they communicate that depth of love, which Vanier at his best knew. The power of the broken to bring us into conversion. They become agents of conversion for us. We often think, okay, the mentally challenged, they're the weak, they're the broken, they need us. We're going to go and we're going to take care of them. We're going to convert them, and then what happens? They find out that the volunteers that come in from outside, the associates come in from outside, they are the ones that become converted. It's the others are already themselves. They're comfortable in their skin. They know who they are, right? They don't set up all the complicated and sophisticated ploys and stratagems that allow us to be who we are. They just are who they are. And in doing that, they give us space to feel comfortable, and perhaps even in the public celebration of joy. And we don't know how to deal with it the first time. I remember Henry Nouwen. Some of you may know him. He was a Dutch priest and a psychologist. He wrote about 39 books. Hugely successful. Perhaps his most successful was a book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, which is a beautiful reflection on the Rembrandt painting based on the Luke parable of the prodigal son, and which is, of course, going to be one of the parables we'll be dealing with throughout the Lenten season. And Nouwen would often comment on this. He said, I talk about the beloved, I'm doing all this kind of stuff. I need the others to teach me that I am actually capable of being loved. I don't even believe that. So I'm going around writing books. I'm a psychologist. I'm a very famous professor at Yale, and I was at Harvard. Then I give it all up to spend time with the mentally challenged. And then finally, I discovered joy in my life. Okay. And I think that those moments are very special, because when we are with the vulnerable, when we are with the broken, when we are with those who have no pretense, those who are just simply alone, naked unto the world, we can learn all kinds of things. The most successful people, the wealthiest people, and I've met many of them, are not always happy in their own skin. They're not comfortable in their skin. They're always fearful of what they will lose. It takes a special generosity to break out of that. That's why when you look at Jesus's parables, especially with the young man, whom he loves and who cannot give up everything. Right. These are the kind of special moments of conversion with the broken, and it may not just be the mentally challenged. It may be the opioid addict on the street, or it may be somebody who's pushing his grocery cart with him because he's got everything that he has is in that. Right. Sometimes it just takes a matter of stopping and saying hello. My eldest daughter is a mental health worker. She's a short story writer. She's a writer, but she also works in mental health care. And I remember on one particular occasion when I was giving some money to some people on the streets in Toronto, and she said, Dad, it's not the money they need. They need you to look at them and to talk to them. Just don't put the coin there. Ask them their name. It's human contact. It's affirmation that somehow in that special moment, they matter. That's grace. That's doing the work of Jesus. And it took me decades to figure that one out. And it's not even complicated. So we get ourselves in a situation, as I say, we intellectualize everything and we institutionalize everything. And sometimes it's very simple. Some of our most arresting saints have not been intellectuals, have not been learned academics. They've been the simple. And I don't mean the unlettered by that. I mean their approach to life and to the other is uncluttered and open. And there's a divine simplicity in that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Higgins.
How are we doing with time there, sister? I'm conscious of the fact we're only going to 8:30. I think we have a couple of more questions.
Yeah, with a few more beautiful questions.
Okay, let's go for it. I just talked too long.
All right. How can faith in God play a role in healing the mentally challenged? No, I did ask that. Sorry about that. Yeah. How to best handle spiritual dryness or boredom?
That's a very good question, because we so often face that, right? Our prayers become dry. Everything becomes rote. And it's especially at those times that we need the prayer, because we need the grounding. Sometimes when you say to yourself, oh, well, it's just a ritual, it doesn't mean anything to me anymore. Yes, it does. It gives focus and structure to your day. It gives it resituates you in something that may not be meaningful to you right now, but that doesn't mean that won't pass. Again, the spiritual life is a life of ups and downs, right? Moments of ecstasy and moments of agony, moments of light, the cataphatic, full of joy and effusive light, and then the apophatic, which is the desert experience and the absence of God. And they work together in our lives, and they don't always work with high drama. It can be just simply that we feel spiritually dry. Sometimes God speaks to our heart in those moments of spiritual dryness. And that's where our presence in the world as active agents, that's when it's really called forward, not when we're feeling good about it, but when we feel an inner obligation to do it because it's the right thing to do. I mean, sometimes we just don't want to do it, right? And it's very natural to not to want to do it. Who wants to spend time in the gutter? Nobody wants to spend any time in the gutter, right? But in an important way, those who work with people in the gutter don't do it because they think, oh, this is a romantic option. I'm looking forward to doing this because it makes me feel good. No, but because they come out of a moral imperative, an imperative of compassion, love, and self-emptiness. And sometimes, yes, that gives you a feeling of accomplishment. More often than not, it doesn't do that. You know, the spiritual life isn't a life of checking off the accomplishments. You know, when I was a grade school kid in Toronto in a Catholic school, St. Thomas Aquinas, in those days, during Lent, you would, if you did something good, you would go to the back of the class and you'd have these little hearts that you would color in. And you might try to make sure you got all the 40 hearts done. And it was a nice idea. But what it did was to create and embed in the mind of the children that spiritual life is a quantitative exercise. Like the more prayers, the more hearts you fill in, the more you do this, you're building up, you're earning God's affection. You never have to earn God's affection. Okay, that's Pelagianism. We don't have to earn God's affection. We don't have to earn God's love. I mean, that's unearned. We have it. It's ours. All right. So we don't need to worry about that. But if your spiritual life is a matter of building up blocks to say, well, okay, now I've got God. I've got God in my little citadel here, and now I know what's going on. It's not going to work because God is not confinable. God, you can't circumscribe God. You can't control God. And so often in our lives, we want to do that because why? Because we feel out of control. We live in a world of chaos often, and we impose order on it, but it's an artificial order. And so sometimes when the Spirit comes erupting in our lives, it shatters this and creates chaos. You know, how am I going to deal with this? I can tell you, some of the saints, you read the lives of some of the saints, this is not what they wanted. You know, Ignatius of Loyola didn't want that cannonball, right? John Henry Cardinal Nouwen loved being an Anglican cleric. And we kind of forget that when he became a Roman Catholic priest, he went into a dark space because Catholicism, Roman Catholicism in particular, was intellectually his home. It was his spiritual home, but it wasn't his aesthetic home. It wasn't his emotional home. That was his own Anglican church. So he had a tough time, and people were highly critical of him, and bishops deeply suspicious. And Pope Pius IX never trusted him. It wasn't until Pope Leo XIII in 1878 that Nouwen was rehabilitated and made a cardinal. But he'd already been a Catholic since 1845. So you see, sometimes conversions have great costs. And you say, well, I'm going to convert now, everything's going to be fine. No, it's not. There may be heavy penalties for this, right? Conversion is never an invitation to a comfortable life. It will always be, in its way, unsettling. But that's what the spiritual life is about, right? When we get settled spiritually, that's when we have to worry.
And Dr. Higgins, how can we, one of our attendees asks, effectively bring back our teens who have been raised Catholic, studied in high schools, Catholic high schools, and then they go to university and they lose their faith and they somewhat say goodbye to God?
Well, if I've heard that question once, I've heard it 100 times from parents and from faculty who come to me and they say, you know, I've raised my children and none of them go to church anymore. And what am I going to do about it? Is it a mark of failure on my part? Where have I fallen down? Or are my children unusual in this? Well, no, they're not. They're quite ordinary. The vast majority of the current generation, the millennial generation or whatever, are disengaged from the church. They're not hostile, by the way. It's not that they're antagonistic to the church. The church doesn't touch their hearts or imagination. So we have a big task ahead of us. But I don't think we should have a despair that they won't be touched. They will. I find that they're the most spiritually longing generation I've seen in a long time. And I've been in this business, a university professor for over 40 years. I've been a president 3 times. I know something about what happens in university among students. And I don't despair of them. I think despair is not the way to go. It's not God's way. If God doesn't despair of them, why should we? What we need is again, that integrity of living. If they see that these things matter to you, and they ask you questions about it, and they can be probing, and move beyond a period of nascent rebellion and indifference to a time when they say, you know, I need a community. Let me put this in the starkest possible terms. We live in a time of massive and ubiquitous communication. Everybody's communicating, but we don't have any communion. In universities right now, not here at Corpus Christi and St. Mark's, because we don't have any residences. But in all the universities I've been in that have residences, and that's been all of them, we've had to increase the psychological and spiritual counseling services. We've had to redesign our architecture to force them out of their rooms into the hallway because they just move into their rooms. First-year students, they have their Facebook, they have their social network, and they're cut off. There's no interaction. It's dehumanizing, and it has huge debilitating effects on their mental health. I was talking to a friend of mine who was for 25 years was a dean of residence and students at a large university on the eastern coast of the United States. And he said, you know, in the last 20 years, the number of cases of suicidal ideation has increased 100-fold. He said, you know, now I have to worry about this all the time. So what's happened? And what's happening to our culture and our society as it fractures? Well, as it fractures and it becomes more individual, atomized, everybody doing their own thing, we have the complete breakdown of communion. Oh yeah, we have communication. People are talking to each other all the time on their cell phone and everything else. That's not the same thing. Passing on information is not the same thing. Talking about how many people like me, it's illusionary. It's artificial. What really matters is communion, the body, matter, presence, these things. That's why it's so important for us in the universities to get our students back on the campus as soon as the public health authorities give us permission to do so, because it's critical to their spiritual, physical, and emotional well-being, right? And that's true of all these particular cases. Yes, the teens will leave the church. I remember one time talking to an eminent theologian who actually, he never left the church. He died very much in the church, but he ceased to be a priest. He married and whatnot. And he said, you know, I never understood the argument about people leaving the church. How can you leave the church? But what does that mean, to leave the church? And that's a very deep question, it seems to me. They're not leaving the church. They're on a different route right now. They're departing from what there has been the home they understand. Some of it will be rebellion. Some of it will be indifference, but the integrity of your witness will keep them focused. They'll always come home. They'll always come home to those that they love. And they'll want to know why it is that my parents are so rude. Why does the Eucharist matter to them? Why do they go to Mass every week? Is it a cultural thing, or are they fed by the Eucharist? And maybe an occasion will arise sometime. It can vary. I've been a Catholic all my life. I've been a seminarian. I've gone all kinds of things. It was on a spiritual retreat when I actually discovered for the first time in my life, I was a dean. I discovered in the first part of the night what it means to yearn for the Eucharist. I never knew what that meant. I went to the Eucharist often enough, but I never understood what it meant to yearn for the Eucharist. That was a very special moment of discovery in the retreat house. And I was a dean. So I mean, give time for our students and for those that we love and the young ones and whatnot. These aren't necessarily radical ruptures. They're departures, they're growth moments, they're probing. And what they need is integrity. And that's why I mentioned earlier, and I mean this, we need institutional integrity because that works contra our efforts. It's very difficult to bring people into the communion when the public signs of our own brokenness are not addressed. But that's the pathology of the spirit.
Thank you. One of our attendees is sharing about the fact that she suffers from depression. So thank you, first of all, for sharing that with us. And she feels like the parishes are not reaching out. So she feels excluded. She says, why do the parish and the parish community does not reach out when they know that we're there, people who suffer of depression? So any insights and any thoughts of how we could advise maybe our parish communities to be more in tune with their people and to be able to reach out to them more effectively?
But I think sometimes in the case of people who suffer from depression, and their numbers are very large, by the way, and sometimes it's clinical depression, sometimes it's cyclical depression, sometimes we have every reason to be depressed. I mean, there are occasions when depression is a very natural thing, right? We always want to anesthetize everything. Oh, I'm depressed, I need a pill. No, sometimes depression is the human body, human mind working within something. But when we have other instances of consistent depression or clinical depression, how do people feel comfortable in working with them? That's where we need organizations and webinars that work with mental health, organizations to come together of like-minded people who are trying to find ways of witness that deal with issues of those who suffer. And I think it's a big issue in our culture because very interestingly, although we are coming to a deeper awareness of mental illness and we're comfortable at least talking about that in a public setting, which is very different from the earlier time when we did not do that. It was seen as something that we just want to cover up. So we've actually progressed, but we haven't progressed to the point that we know how to deal with it. So we haven't developed the pastoral strategies. We haven't developed the other things to say, okay, well, how do we work with this now? People are no longer ashamed to mention this. They write memoirs about it. They come out, they give press conferences, they talk to their families. This is all good, by the way, because nothing is ever good when it's in the dark. So it's good to have it in the light. But then we're still at that point where we haven't worked out, like, what are our strategies of redress, of correction, of healing? And it's one of the big challenges of our time. And I don't make light of it. It's one of the big challenges of our time. And I know in some parishes, we have parish nurses in various of the churches in the St. John Diocese in New Brunswick. And I thought this was a very, very good development, where a parish nurse was part of the parish team, and her job would, in many ways, would be visit people who were experiencing acute depression or malnutrition or other things, but reminding people that the church is there for them in so many other ways outside of the weekly celebration of the Eucharist. It's because it's a caring community, and the gospel calls us to a life of care. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. This was wonderful. And so we're very grateful. And everyone, if you would like Dr. Higgins more, he is the president of St. Mark's and Corpus Christi College. So you will find him on campus. Hopefully, Dr. Higgins will know of some of your talks coming up if anything is being done out of the college, and we'll love to have you back. So grateful for your many expertise and for the real message that you have given us. So thank you so much for leading us into this Lenten season.
My pleasure, sister. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We'll look forward to have you again, hopefully in the near future. So many blessings and some messages of gratitude are coming in from you for you and your message. And so we'll continue to journey together to turn towards God ever more deeply with one another and support our community members. Obviously, as we saw, there are many people who need to be supported, who need to be engaged, who would love for us to reach out to them, whether they are the materially poor or the spiritually poor, or people who suffer in many different ways, especially throughout this time of the pandemic. I think depression and mental illness has been hitting our society and our homes in a very real way. So thank you to all of you for participating, and thank you for being brothers and sisters to one another and extending a hand to our brothers and sisters more in need. So to conclude, we'll have a few upcoming events to share with all of you. And our next Into the Deep session, we'll have with us Father Mark McGuckin, And Father is the pastor of St. Joseph's Parish in Port Moody, and he will present on March 19th, the great feast of St. Joseph. And on that day, as we continue to celebrate the feast of St. Joseph, we also will begin our special celebration of the year of the family. So Father Mark will address and speak to us about St. Joseph, the patron of all families, the greatest of all fathers, the patron of our nation, Canada, and the universal church. The church is a family of families. And so St. Joseph is our guardian, and he is the guardian of our own family. And as we know, families are one of our greatest treasures. And also, I'd like to share with you that our Behold community, Behold is our Archdiocese website, and our promoting what is called Make Room. So make more room in our lives for a time of prayer throughout this Lenten season. So please visit our website, Behold, and you will find many opportunities to join in and to work with one another to be able to make room, in a room that will mainly be filled by Jesus Christ's love for us. We're also celebrating 40 Days for Life. So many brothers and sisters are engaging every night at 8 o'clock to pray the rosary together for the protection of all life from conception to natural death. We know what the situation is in Canada with abortion, and also we have known how Bill C-7 has been passed at the Senate. And so our prayers are very, very important. And lastly, please consider to pray for one of our seminarians during this Lenten season. We have created a calendar that you can find on our website, and you can adopt one of our seminarians and pray for them throughout this season. So thank you again, and thank you to Raisa Jose that has been behind the scene running for us the show. And again, I'm Sister Angela Marie Castellani, the Adult Faith Formation Coordinator for the Archdiocese, and I look forward to seeing all of you next month. May God bless you, and may your Lenten journey be blessed and always open to turning towards God more closely and deeply, individually and with one another within our parish and church community. So thank you again, Dr. Higgins,
Oh, it's
and
my
good night,
pleasure.
everyone. God bless you all.
Good night now. God
Good
bless.
night. God bless you.